So hi everyone, thanks a lot for joining this 10th Urban AI conversation. My name is Hubert and I'm the founder of Urban AI. So what is Urban AI? Urban AI is a think tank that federates a global community of pioneers in the emerging field of urban artificial intelligence. Together, we are investigating this concept and we propose ethical modes of governance and sustainable uses of urban artificial intelligence. But Urban AI is also a space for exchange and debate, and this is why we regularly organize these Urban AI conversations, during which contributors and experts of our community can present you the latest contribution, research, or even just ideas. And for this Urban AI conversation, we have the great pleasure and honor to have with us Zhongwen Huang and Yiwen Tei. So Zhongwen Huang, you are the Director of the Design and Planning Lab at the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore. And Yiwen Tei, you are the Deputy Director of Planning Technologies and Analytics at Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore. And today, together, we are going to answer the following question. How is Singapore using urban artificial intelligence? So as usual, we will have 20 minutes, 25 minutes of presentation from our speakers, and then we will have a Q&A session with all of you. So if you have questions in mind, feel free to use the chat, or you can wait for the Q&A session and directly ask your question. Zhongwen and Yiwen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Actually, just a quick clarification. Zhongwen recently moved to the Smart City Planning Office. It's at the center of government, but still definitely very, very close to the conversation and to the topic at heart. And we still talk a lot about this topic. So very good to have him here. Zhongwen, you want to present for me? I think we have a small group, so we'll try and keep the presentation short, and then I think it's always nicer to have a presentation, to have a discussion subsequently. Yeah. For our international colleagues here, there will be a bit of a segment on just a quick one on really orientating you as to our planning context and to Singapore. Yeah, so just a bit of a background. I come from the Urban Redevelopment Authority. That's the National Land Use Planning Authority of Singapore. So that's URA. Yeah. So if you haven't been to Singapore, when COVID is better, you can come and then you can walk this very nice bridge called the Henderson Waves. Yeah, it's usually very nice. And so a bit of context for those of you who are unfamiliar, but most of you are familiar already. So what distinguishes Singapore from perhaps other cities or other states is that we have to balance the needs of both. So we have the needs of cities as well as the nation. So for instance, we have to cater for the land of defense, and actually our defense needs already takes up an equivalent amount of land, about 20%. So that's equivalent to the amount of land set aside for housing. So that's pretty substantial. In terms of density, we're the second densest nation after Monaco. So that's pretty substantial. And so we try to balance all of these various needs within our limited land and sea space. So just a quick glance as to our planning objectives. The last statutory plan that we set out was in 2019. So I mean, that was pre-COVID. And what we really set out then was looking at centralized housing and decentralized employment nodes. So really looking at situating housing and employment close together. That's because one of the key problems we saw, and that's less of an issue now with COVID, we saw at that time was really there's a lot of congestion within the central business district. So we're looking at dispersing housing out in what we call poly centers around the island so that people had to travel less to get to their workplaces. We also saw that we wanted to expand recreational opportunities throughout. So our target has since changed, but it's now 100% of households within 400 meters of a park and really expanding the cycling networks. We know a lot has since changed since 2019. So since then, we've embarked on what is called our long-term plan. And we've seen that COVID-19 has shown us that many things can change. So for instance, we've seen that a lot of people, they don't go to the office anymore. I'm presenting from home, so they work from home. Then we have conversations about whether there is a need for the CBD anymore. Is that still a useful concept to have? Is there still a need to have so much office space, right? And we continue to deal with that, as well as to deal with also the existential factors that we have to face, including climate change, like how much seawalls do we have to build in order to adapt to sea level rise in our city, as well as exogenous factors. So things happening outside our city, is there still going to be an open economy? Are there going to be changes in geopolitical forces, and how is that going to change our economy? So all these things are happening even as we are planning for our city. So therefore, there's a need for flexibility and optionality. So those are the keywords that we're looking for in terms of how we're approaching the long-term plan that Singapore is looking at currently. So we're changing towards a more deterministic way of planning, that is with certain fixed population parameters, certain fixed GDP scenarios, towards something that is more like scenario-based planning. So we classify our trends based on what is called known unknowns and versus unknown unknowns. And then we try to identify scenarios based on this. It is a mouthful of words, but we're trying to pin all of these down. And how we guide ourselves is, what are the signposts that will tell us where we are headed, which scenarios we are headed towards. And when we know which scenarios we are headed towards, then which tracts of land do we trigger for these certain land users? Right. So that can all sound a bit waffly, but roughly it looks something like this. So let's say you're looking at a scenario where there could be a chance of high telecommuting versus low telecommuting, or high decentralization. That means people work away from the central business district versus low decentralization. So what are the various scenarios you could have around the city in terms of having office spaces? And what are the signposts that will tell you which scenarios you're heading towards? So this is something that we're looking at in terms of the long-term plan. So with all this uncertainty, right, and this need to safeguard flexibility and optionality, how can, the use of data analytics and increasingly the use of AI help us? We think that there's a lot of potential here because there's so much data out there in order to guide us on this path, in order to allow us to track these signposts easily. And importantly, in order to allow us to do ground sensing, to let us know whether our plans are working on ground or not, right? In the past, where data was not so available, or perhaps where there was a lot of cost to collecting this data, then it's more difficult for planners to really understand whether plans are really working on ground. So you would have to walk the ground yourself to understand that. So based on that, there is now even more greater impetus for us to look at digital planning and see how data and technology can really transform the way we look at urban planning and design. I think these have always been the key thrust for us at URA when we look at digital transformation. So one, we start with ourselves. That is for our organization to work in productive ways, to make evidence-based decisions that is based on data. Next, then really recognizing that planning is an ecosystem. So planning is not just about URA. We work with the Transport Authority, we work with the parks planning people, we work with all kinds of agencies as well, increasing with climate change, the Public Utilities Board. So the whole of government needs to come together as well. We also have to convince people to give us money to build in some of this infrastructure, to invest in data and capability. So the whole of government needs to come together. And then thirdly, it's also working with the industry. In Singapore, sometimes we tend to look at the government for a lot of things, but actually the industry also has a lot of creativity. They have a lot of ideas. And without also leveling up the industry and tapping on that wider ecosystem out there, it's very hard for us to scale up these gains. So we're talking about the industry in terms of your architects, your developers, your construction, facilities management, the whole value chain, right? So I think just looking back as to where we've come, I think the only reason we're able to tap on some of these deeper insights like data, like analytics, like AI now, is because we have made some inroads into digitizing data, into developing some kind of a data strategy in the past. So there is some kind of foundation upon which we sit on. I mean, it's not perfect. We still do have a lot of data issues that we struggle with daily, but at least it's something that we start with. And then from there, then we go on towards looking at more advanced things like exploring AI. And recently we have set up this thing called the URBEC. So it's a center of excellence that tries to cohere government agencies together in looking at urban planning and design. I think we've come to the stage where we realize that, okay, we've done enough. We've set up these capabilities. So we want to bring other agencies with us as well so that they can transform their processes. So the whole ecosystem can probably level up in this. So we're still setting this up, and yeah. Okay, so what we've done is taken a look at applying data analytics for more evidence-based planning. This spans across all kinds of different areas. So we start at the most basic, for instance, population. I'll have some more details on this later, but population is really the backbone because from there it informs the placement of other facilities, for instance, your amenities, your transport systems, and the economy as well. From there, then it really tells us where we should place facilities. So how we do this is first we look at the top line demand indicators, right? Where are the gaps? Where's the demand happening? Then we look at supply. Where is the land available? What's the vacancy, the tenure like today? And this one you really need a good handle on the data you have, because there's going to be land that has been staged far in advance. There is land that's going to be there for 2 to 3 years. So you want a system based to this and be able to tell you very quickly. Let's say COVID-19 is here. The very next day, you might have to activate certain sites quite quickly to have quarantine centers out there. So these are things that we need to rely on in times of emergencies. So you overlay your supply, your demand, you get the gap analysis. But is that going to be the right area to put these things? That's where we depend on the ground feedback on the ground. The ground feedback that I talked about. This can come about in the form of sensors. Is there going to be good occupancy on ground? Are there complaints from people that say that, oh, there's a lot of noise coming from this area, there's a lot of smell, for instance, or there's not enough greenery from this area? So that gives us the feedback here that then goes into informing us whether it's the right place to place the site. And from then on, we decide whether it's going to be the right place for us. Okay, so this is just a deeper dive into a mobility analytics analysis, for instance, and mobility and land use comes hand in hand. In Singapore, actually, these two agencies are separate, which is sometimes a bit inconvenient because they are so intrinsically tied together, but recently we've embarked on a collaboration, so that's a good thing. And mobility and analytics is very important because it allows us to see where you can travel to within a certain amount of time. So it lets us know if I put some office space here, what is my likely catchment that I'm going to get. So we've been able to find out using public, your tap in, tap out data when you go on to trains and buses, where people are coming in and going out from. So for instance, pre-COVID time, in the central business district, people are coming in all over the island. But in the east, Tampines, the attractors was mostly within the town itself, within Tampines, or perhaps sometimes the town next to it, just in Bedok and Pasir Ris. So we know that the attractors are nearby, and that's where the networks are from. So that allows us to, one, plan land use, and then two, to plan the transport networks accordingly. And also then with that feedback data, we can tweak our transport models and our land use planning accordingly. And we can also zoom in at a more micro level. When we see that people are taking short trips, for instance, bus rides, then we can decide how we want to change their behaviors in certain ways. So there has been a push towards more car-like strategies, like encouraging people to walk or cycle more. So if we see that people are taking a lot of short rides, perhaps less than 15 kilometers in certain areas, then we're like, okay, maybe we should be building a cycling path here, so that we can encourage people to cycle here rather than take these short bus rides. Then we can zoom in further as to, what would make this area conducive to cycle. Should I flatten this slope? Should I plant more trees? And then really go deep dive into some of these more urban design strategies. Yeah. In terms of town demographics, which I touched on earlier, it's previously we used to go a bit more of by a norm-based kind of planning. So if I have maybe 10,000 people, I would plan a polyclinic in this area. But now with more data, we're able to see, oh, is this town projected to age more quickly? Is this town going to be younger than the rest? And based on that, then I can tell, okay, maybe I should be providing more childcare centers in this area. I should be providing more senior care centers in this area. And it's going to change over time. Like in 10, 15 years, I might not need a childcare center anymore. So that space that I safeguarded for a childcare center might need to change to a senior care center. So then we need, as planners, we then need to consider how to make sure I safeguard this space in a flexible way and in a flexible configuration so that I can change the use of this space next time. So what the data can do is that I highlight these trends, and then planners then also need to understand how to design for such flexibility. Yeah, of course, these projections are not always the most accurate. There is an error band within, so we do have to continuously refine these. Yeah, so there is also always a process of teaching the planners what goes into these models and how to use these models. Yeah. And I think recently we've also started on this walking network data collection. And this is something that we've really gotten a lot of ground volunteers to come in and really map out. So we have really good mapping in terms of our road networks, but not so much in terms of our walking networks. And if you've been to Singapore before, you know that our public housing development board, the public housing areas, they are very porous. So you really do have to go down and map these paths. And once we map out these paths, you can tag them with attributes. For instance, are they barrier free? Do they have slopes? Is there a step in this area? Then you can, so from there you can see, oh, okay, is this going to be a sheltered path that I can walk to when it's raining? If it's an area that has a lot of seniors, can they easily get to the amenities that they want to? Because then we can overlay it with, a hawker center, the market, healthcare facilities. So that's what we're currently working on right now. Yeah. Okay. Recently for COVID-19, we also did this like space out. Sometimes when people talk about smart technology, actually you realize if the some a tool like this, right, the difficult part is engaging people in order to get their data, but the tool itself is it can be quite simple. It's just a visualization to tell you, hey, this area is pretty crowded, you might not want to go there right now, you might want to go there later. But I think this was a really big effort. Zhongwen was deeply involved in this to really pull supermarkets here to give you their data to say that, okay, these are the counts that's happening on ground, because they are legally mandated to make sure that it doesn't exceed a certain number. So they're collecting that data anyway. So it's just aggregating this data. So this website is still available, and I think recently the Omicron variant, it has become more popular again. So we're still maintaining this right now. Okay. Oh no, it's a PDF, so this doesn't load. But in-house, we also have this tool called ePlanner that really allows planners to have this data for quick visualization and analysis. Sometimes when you want to do a quick understanding of what's happening on ground, right? Like if you're doing a site visit or if you're at a community engagement event, you just want to understand how far this facility is from this train station. You don't want to pull out ArcGIS. So there's this thing called ePlanner that can open up on your iPad to really have these map layers. So these are just screenshots on what it has. And today we've extended its use to over 48 government agencies. So it's an inward facing tool, but we're looking at how to access control and extend it to certain selected users outside of the government. So moving onward, those are the urban planning bits. Then there's also looking at urban design. I think increasingly we're looking at how to then better meld 2D with 3D. I think traditionally 3D has been a more difficult space to get into because a lot of the 3D tools are quite difficult to learn. So we wanted to further look at how to democratize the use of 3D digital design and really look at tools that are easy to use. So for instance, looking at parametric modeling, right? Can I just say, oh, I want this site, I want it at a certain gross plot ratio, it has to be a residential site, and it will apply certain rules for me because I already know what's the setback like. I already know that there are certain greenery replacement requirements that I can that I can code into this. So what's the envelope going to be like, right? And whether I can use that as a first cut to really understand how it's going to look like. Then from there on, then I can apply further modeling to understand what the parameters are we able to get, what's the shading analysis going to be like, what's your climate outputs going to be like. So you can see on the right that then we're working the housing development board to be able to see what's the wind flow or ventilation. And furthermore, I think I scroll here, even rain. Rain is a big issue in Singapore, especially wind-driven rain, because it gets pretty wet with during monsoon season, especially. Yeah. And increasingly the urban heat island effect, then how do we make sure that we have wind corridors, we make use of, your building materials as far as possible to get this kind of passive cooling effect here. So so we're increasingly looking at these sort of tools so that we can integrate some of these factors for modeling. Okay, I promise I'm getting to the AI bits. Okay, this is the AI bit. I think that all forms a foundation, and you do need a foundation before going into the AI bits, because the domain part is so important, right? We do have a vision for this AI bit, but it's solidly based on the domain. So we must start first with the planning lifecycle. Then we layer on the technology on top of it. And if something is not suitable, like if the problem can be solved with something other than AI, then we'll just choose not to use AI. Yeah. But if AI has potential and has promise, then yeah, why not? We would want to explore that. Okay, so we have two main outcomes for our Plan AI roadmap. It's really to automate these routine tasks, right? And also to do better. That means having decision support tools, because planning can be so complex. There can be many, many steps. Something that we do now will lock in decisions for the future. So how can we play out all these scenarios? It's almost like a chessboard to tell us what's going to happen later. Okay, sorry, let me see what's. Yeah, so when we start with the planning life cycle, there are three main parts to this. So formulation is really what our land use needs. Implementation is we are really getting the use on ground, and then review is really the important part of closing the loop. So at the formulation stage, it's projecting our land and infrastructure requirements, right? Doing site search, where's an optimum area to put the site. So these are kind of like your 2D placement of site areas. Then next is your 3D, right? How tall do you want it? Like what's your building envelope here, the design and massing bit that we want to focus on here. Then subsequently in your implement bit, how do I know, right, when is the right time to stage some of these sites? And then subsequently, it comes to the more regulatory bit of it, that there's a lot of potential to come in and automate, right? That is the assessment of planning and development applications. Do they comply to guidelines? Is there a better way of, is there a better proposal? Is there a better recommendation that can affect my neighbors less, or that can maximize outcomes for my neighbors on the left and right? And then lastly, in the review stage, is there a better way of gathering feedback on the ground, of classifying the feedback, for instance, and understanding the pulse of what's happening on ground and monitoring these trends for me here? So I think we've kind of laid out the different projects that could come through these different planning stages. So one are demand projection models, right? Rather than drawing straight lines, really understanding the different factors and how we can learn from the factors in the past. For site search tool and generative design, you can think of it just like 2D and 3D versions of multi-objective optimization. Right. If I codify certain planning objectives I want 8 square meters of park per person to be within 10 minutes walk per park. And I also want it to be in an area that has low tree cover today, which is the best site available for me. Or give me 5 different sites and tell me the trade-offs across these 5 different sites. And then you present that for the planner to kind of make that decision. And then you have that for one land use like park. Then can you throw in a combination of land users? Okay, say do it for housing, industry, and park. So it's like almost like scenario planning, whether something like that is possible. So that's for the formulation bit. For implementation bit, then it's a lot of planning relies on precedence because we want to be seen as being fair to the community, being fair to developers. So when we receive cases, is there a way for us to quickly retrieve out waivers in the system? And we know that in the past and still today, planners record decisions in a very unstructured form, right? They write and write. So how do we like use natural language processing to be able to pull out this information for us easily so that I can quickly assess the case at hand? So that's where the case retrieval engine comes in. And for intelligent proposal evaluation, because in Singapore now we mandate that a lot of the development proposals, they must come in through BIM. So can I use these BIM models to be able to quickly assess not just a quantitative guideline, but qualitative guidelines in terms of mobility, for instance, is this walking path going to intersect with my cycling path, um, with the path of the car? Is this barbecue pit going to create noise for my neighbors, etc.? And can it even recommend me, alternative solutions for this particular building? That's that. And then in the review stage, we do collect quite a lot of feedback today. We get a lot of complaints. And when we get what's happening on ground today is that we get planners to label them. But people get very tired of labeling things. They're getting a long drop down list of saying, oh, this is rubbish, or this is noise, this is traffic. So can we make use of things like topic classification, where we say, okay, I have certain prefix categories, you kind of use a semi-supervised learning approach, and then you can say that, okay, I'll group these into baskets. And I tell you that, okay, in Pasir Ris, this particular area in Singapore, the topic of loss of greenery is really gaining traction here over the past 6 months, right? Or I tell you that this topic has really split into two, it has diverged over time. And we have applied it to COVID, I think our 2020 data, and we have seen like clearly, the applications for home businesses to URA have increased. So we have done some exploration in this area. And in terms of Air Pocketbook, I think we're still working on that, but really based on the data that we get on ground, what are the right questions to ask so that we know that things going the way we want it to? Okay, that is still a vague question, but I think we really need to pin it down, right? Let's say if we track things like property value, occupancy rates, when do we know that something is off in this area? So for instance, some stuff that we've been tracking on ground would be, say, we do see a lot of place of worships in industrial areas because the rent there is cheap. So what's the kind of signals we can get on ground that tell us that problems like these are emerging, that allow us to go down to take a closer look to decide if we want to change our policies, if we want to do further enforcement. So signals on ground like that can tell us. Yeah, so these are the different thingies we can look at. And yes, I think we are aware there are weaknesses in AI models. So use them very carefully, use them wisely, and be very clear. Make sure it's not a black box. Use them. Okay, I've gone through the feedback analytics layer, but really looking at topic classification. We've already built, Zhongwen will be glad to know that we have finally productionized this layer on ePlanner. So planners are actually using it to look at the trends now. Yeah. And we have also brought the case retrieval engine into the UI environment now, and we're operationalizing it. The optimization modeling I've talked about, it's still under scoping. So, I mean, we're definitely open to talk further about it. I think it's a very difficult topic. It's really about matching demand and supply with a whole lot of different objectives that may not always be codified. I think this one is really a work in progress that we're looking at. Yeah. And not to forget that all this, of course, needs to be supported by data. A lot of times we go into a project and we find that actually a lot of it is due to incorrectly labeled data, or we didn't collect the data a certain way. And sometimes when you develop an AI product, then you need to come back and operationalize it. It's about the system design, it's about legacy systems, it's about maintaining the system, it's about the amount of money it takes to really go and revamp the system. So it's all that work involved in making sure that planners actually use it in the end, it's going to be useful to system design. Then in terms of people upskill, it's do planners understand the assumptions behind this thing, right? Are they going to be comfortable in using it? Are they going to be using it blindly? And that's not something you want as well. And do you have skilled people back in your organization to train the AI models again? Because AI models are only as good as the data it's trained on. And then of course, we always want to be speaking to people out there, like you guys, to learn about what's new out there and whether we're headed on the right track as well. Yeah. Okay, I think that would be the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuan, for your very insightful and inspiring presentation. It's really great to see that using AI in urban planning and for cities is it's a long journey. It's not just about okay, we are going to put AI in our organization, in our system. This is something that is longer. We need to digitalize. We need to collect data. We need to have a plan. So it was really great to see all this, this strategy, this big picture. Maybe I had a question. So if you have a question, of course, feel free to use the chat or to directly open your micro or raise your hand, depending on what you prefer. On my end, I have a question for you, Zhongwen and Yuan. You talked a bit at the beginning of your presentation about climate change. And I was wondering, how do you plan to use AI to be more resilient as a city?
Maybe I take the broader part. And I think that the way we look at how the potential of AI technologies can be used in urban planning lies a lot in how can we make better decisions? How can we be able to respond to changes in a faster, more accurate, and more informed way? I think that when we start to look at some of the possibilities today, where you have AI solutions that are capable of playing strategy games, right? We are already seeing a lot of AI used in search and retrieval, and some are starting to be involved in reasoning to aid in debates and reasoning. And clearly, it is very pervasive in how it is used to detect fraud, detect anomalies. Hence, the question I think we took is, are there similarities in these with the kind of work planners need to do? And because so much of planning is really identifying what are the options and the trade-off between land and infrastructure options, there are a lot of similarities. Therefore, in strategy games, we think about the different moves and trajectories, which are the more optimal and ideal ones. The difficulty lies in the dimensions of things we are trying to optimize or measure. I think in the space of reasoning, I think because of the contextual information, many of them, I don't think we have that much effort put in to organize this information in the right way. And therefore, if we can invest in developing these kind of linkages, whether it's in terms of a knowledge base, then will we be able to also have a point where planners can be supported by machines in doing the reasoning and option analysis. And then the third part, in terms of identifying anomalies, all right, the same. And I think on your question on climate change, climate change, I think in Singapore's context is very real. Whether there's anyone who have myths about it or not, I will leave that debate outside the door. But it is very real. And because it is very real, we need to think about it in many ways. You herself was quite involved in various climate change related policy and research over the years. But why are we interested in how we improve the way we decide land use, the massing, the wind flows? A lot of this lies in our interest in being able to scout the city and shape the city in a way that also minimizes some of its environmental impacts, that's able to harness natural wind flows, that allows us to have comfortable spaces and environments without the need for too much artificial solutions, right? I think that in terms of what we are also looking at when we evaluate proposals, why we start to look at things like how do we guide developers and designers in improving walking spaces, promote active mobility. Part of it is also trying to contribute towards shifting people away from driving, towards more low carbon modes of commute. I think in terms of how we want to make sense of the way activities take place in the city, how the infrastructure uses resources. I think it becomes more and more possible today to be able to tag where perhaps there is room for reduction in usage. There is room to optimize our usage. And I think this in some way contributes towards how we mitigate against climate change. Certainly on issues relating to heavier rains, higher temperatures, rising sea levels. I mean, these are things we also need to figure out, and they have impact both at the macro scale as well as the micro scale. So I think the way we can use the AI solutions or technologies that aid us in options analysis, understanding what could be areas that we can intervene in more precisely. I think that is those are some of the linkages, but they're probably beyond that as well.
Thanks, Zhongwen. Just maybe another question, because in one of your first slides, you explained that the next step in your AI journey is to have a better AI expertise. What do you mean by AI expertise, and how will you achieve this goal?
Yeah, I think how it's set up in URA is having that interdisciplinary team. Actually, we have quite a small team. So myself, I come from a planning/sociology background, so really from a domain angle. And then we have people that come in from technical angle. So from a technical angle, that can be computer science, and then if they are deeper into AI. AI is also a broad field. So within AI, then it's finding the right people in the right fields. So in recent years, we've focused quite a lot on natural language processing, machine learning, for instance. So these are fields that we want to go more deeply into. But I think also, so these are things we have. And I think the challenge with building up AI expertise that I think some others may find is that in urban planning, it's quite a different setup from a tech company. So I think it tends to attract people who AI talents who are not just interested, in the technology itself, but they do also need to be quite interested in the domain. Because if you're really interested in the technology, then there are very deep tech companies that they can into is taking a bit long. But you are AI, right? You really need to talk to and really understand the domain, because a lot about it is like customizing the technology to what we really need, that use case. So I think that for us is really the challenge, and yet also probably the opportunity that lies within there to really develop that intersection of planning and AI. I think it's something that we hope to talk to more people in and get more people interested in. Yeah.
And because I know, actually, Zhongwen, you know that in the community, we have Lawrence Liu from AI Singapore. So this is also why I asked this question, like, do you have some link with AI Singapore or?
Yeah, I think capability is a challenging task for everyone. I'm sure everyone here recognize that. I think what you mentioned about finding the right match. I mean, the right match in terms of the talent with the topic itself is very important. I think where perhaps if I take a broader lens, I think what we want is, of course, to have meaningful things that we are working on, things that are exciting, that's impactful, and people feel that this is actually what we want to be associated with doing, right? And I think what Evan has shared, it's a glimpse of some of the things that going on, and how we see the topic itself. I think in terms of how we have worked with AI Singapore, I think there has been quite a lot of exchanges. And the good thing with AI Singapore and what Lawrence has been doing is to make sure that there is a growing pool of talent available in Singapore today in terms of AI engineering. I mean, we can't productionize if we don't have sufficient people with the right skills. So when the larger ecosystem grows, there are more people who have the competencies. Then it is natural that when they have competencies, they will look for meaningful topics to work on. And I think that's one area that we certainly are always in touch with them on, both in terms of people who are looking at transitions in their careers, as well as people who are starting out in their careers. In fact, I think the former director for R&D at AI Singapore, who is Prof. Leong, I think she's now one of the advisors to Yori on Plan AI. I think that's the third part, which is the value of being able to partner with the larger ecosystem, both locally and globally. And I think that's why I think this conversation is a very meaningful one. I think we certainly hope to take it further with everyone.
Thanks, Zhongwen. Thanks also, Yuan, for your answer. We have a question in the chat. Okay, so you already answered, Yuan, but maybe would you agree to to answer for everyone?
The second part, I guess, like about how data is like entropy, and then it grows and grows and just keeps getting out of hand. And yeah, it's very hard to find, a scalable, sustainable way of keeping data in check. On the second part of your question, right, how do you ensure the veracity of the data used and customizing it for the training of your AI? Actually, we realized that the more we do all these AI exploration, the more we learn about our data, and then it becomes an iterative loop almost, because then you realize how dirty your data is or how badly your system is designed to collect your data, and then you go back to the line groups and be like, aha, you should collect your data in a different way, so we should change our system so that the AI can work better, and then we can get these productivity improvements. So yeah, it's a continuous cycle.
I think if I add another lens to it, is that we need to recognize that data is cost. I mean, many people talk about data being the oil and the air and whatever other analogy there is. Collecting, storing, cleaning, these are all costs. None of them actually has any returns until you can make good use of it. And because it is cost, it is, I think, quite natural that the tendency is to see how to keep the cost as low as possible. I think the one part I feel over the years is the importance of enabling value to be unlocked and enabling members of the organization who are part of that journey, who need to ensure the data quality is good, to also feel that they can benefit when the data quality improves. That is not very easy, but I think that is somewhat, I think, quite important now to just add on to that.
Yeah, thank you very much for clarifying.
I have a question about probably both of you. It's about, I mean, at the moment you have, I think it was planning in the age of AI, and when you formulate land use plan and guideline, I mean, it seems that you are still, how to say, in a tradition of planning which is 2D. Well, I mean, in fact, I mean, you are very much, I mean, well, Hong Kong is even more, I mean, but we are in the city are quite 3D. The land use is not quite 2D as well. We all know that, but we still kind of like stick to. I like the fact that you recognize that most of the tools at the moment in 3D are still kind of very difficult to learn for everybody, and that's a challenge in a funny way. I mean, you will say Google 3D is probably the most easy 3D things that you can find around. And the kind of switching between the street view and the kind of 3D is quite amazing. So I was wondering, I think I read that you recently released a digital twin of Singapore, and whether, I mean, okay, the digital twin obviously is in 3D, and whether you will implement something like, I mean, in the way, I mean, a little bit like Google 3D and Street View, where as simple than that, anybody can almost like kind of like use it, because it's true that the 3D is a big cost, but I mean, it makes so much difference to understand the place at the same time in a way. So I'm just wondering your thought about those things.
I think that I think recently the Singapore Land Authority, I think, who has been building up the 3D models, I think they have sort of made it more widely available for the industry to be able to incorporate it one facet of it. I think earlier what you mentioned is something even bigger than that. I mean, I think that there has been a few areas. Maybe I can point out 3 things that may be relevant to this and good to get your thoughts as well. Actually, technically, Singapore has always been developing itself in a 3-dimensional space because of similar to what you have dimensional way. Have we captured many of these 3-dimensional information in the most optimal way? Perhaps I think we could improve. We could improve in quite a few things. I mean, when we start to develop up and down the issue of how to the regulations, how to the ownership, like tenure, how do the approved use, how do we look at the building infrastructure in a 3-dimensional way, become more and more important. So in fact, that's one of the work that Yuri is also looking at in how to organize all these different information in a more 3-dimensional way better. And that forms probably a base. It's a journey. I think the last time you shared about the work you're doing in looking at the pathways on the 3-dimensional space, I think that's something we will need to continue to learn from you and the rest of the community on what's the right way and best way to do it. I mean, the walking network that Ewan mentioned just now, we had to grapple with quite a bit of things like, for example, how do you represent the stairways from the road to the pedestrian overhead bridges, and then there are lifts, and then because we have slopes, so sometimes the path is on the ground on one level, but it's actually coming out on a different height at a different level, and how do we deal with all these? And then when we have, I remember a mall that has a basement 2 connection, a basement 1 connection, a level 1, level 2 connection, and they all overlap. Then how do we do it? So those are things that I think we need to figure out how to do that part better. I think in terms of the architecture practice, which you're also from, I think that what we are seeing is more and more architects are digitally savvy, and they are very capable in using a lot of 3D tools, both from the parametric end to the visualization end. And I think that's what we want to harness and to excite our architects to be able to apply what they are trained in, and increasingly from the schools, and bring that to transform the practice. So that's one thing that's going on. I mean, within the team at URA, there's also a team of architects that are now housed within the same unit, and their job is to dream of the future and make it happen. So this is all of the second part, I guess.
Yeah, another question with AI, I think, I mean, you mentioned it, is that I mean, you focus on semantic, because I mean, the other focus of AI is often image, which is not necessarily the most important in a way. And I noticed that as well in a way. Semantic is quite a good way of retrieving a lot of things. And I'm looking at graph kind of neural net in a way, which I mean, then are useful because you can work in 3D, and you can go work with network and so on, which might be more interesting. But there's some focus on image as well. Although I mean, a lot of things have been done with Street View and a lot of stuff. I was interested on something that you mentioned at the beginning. I mean, as well, conceptually, I mean, the idea of detecting anomaly, or even, I mean, at the beginning you mentioned, I mean, optioneering and scenario making, and that's quite kind of demanding conceptually and so on. And what Ewan mentioned was something about identifying the kind of point in a way where you could trigger a scenario, which kind of like very interesting because if you, we try to teach optioneering to our students, which are sometimes very resistant to that. But I mean, it's quite intriguing as well because otherwise, and I'm kind of doing that because we're working on endowment on doing a new town, and I'm kind of wondering whether we keep the optioneering fluid, and then we kind of engage them with the idea of like discovering what would be the triggers that trigger this path or that path in a way. And I suppose that's what Ewan was kind of mentioning. And that's probably quite demanding. And I don't know if you, I mean, if you have some kind of like lesson learned on that side in a way, because that's quite an interesting novelty, I would say. Because I mean, yes, I mean, it's true that I mean, optioneering and scenario making has been around for a long time. But Ewan, you mentioned that with new data and then real-time data, that's where it becomes somehow a way to say, okay, well, now we are more on that path that on this than this one. That's fascinating. Is this happening very much already, or is it kind of like just beginning to happen? Or
Okay. I will take this first, then Ewan please add on. I think it's quite real. It's quite real in a few ways. So I mean, one of the projects or studies we did during COVID was that there was a study to look at how do we optimize the way we do distribution of, and in particular during COVID when we had a certain lockdown arrangement. This was during circuit breaker. There was some study we did to look at how to deliver food to vulnerable seniors who were unable to leave their homes. And because they were distributed over the island and we had limited resource, there was an attempt to see if we only can support a certain X number of launch points, then where are the launch points we should have based on the data about where the recipients were residing. And therefore the optioneering comes in a few ways in terms of then what are the kind of thresholds we want to set, what is the number we are trying to determine in terms of the options for launch points, and we measure the difference between the different options. So that was one aspect that was quite real. When we subsequently did a further study, this was one of the other social amenities, where we were looking at more of a medium-term planning for where should we be siting new ones. Again, it also was looking at both how the demand pattern looks like, and in that case, it wasn't just looking at what it looks like today, but it was making an attempt to forecast how the demand at different neighborhoods would evolve in the coming years, and based on the spaces that are likely to be available, or that based on where some of the facilities were already at, how do we identify which combination of sites would give us a better outcome? And how do the performance of these different sites vary year on year? Because sometimes it may be a case that in the shorter term, it may not be the most ideal, but it may pan out better in the longer term. But it could also be the reverse, whereby it may seem better in the short to medium term, but it may actually be quite suboptimal in the longer term. So the use of such models then become very handy in being able to measure these things, which in the past is quite hard to measure. What are the difficulties? The difficulties come in when we need to be quite precise in the cost functions and in what we want to optimize. And when there are multiple type of users, it can be quite tricky to be able to specify that and at the same time translate it into an equation. Because the equation needs to factor in not just what is it that we're trying to measure, but the interaction between the increase in one factor and how another factor would contract. That we were at a very early stage. I think so as you mentioned, the scoping, I think that's something that needs a lot of gray cells to figure that out. And that's why I feel it does need a bigger community to come together, because there are probably quite a lot of commonalities in terms of accessibility, in terms of utilization, in terms of some of the social benefits.
Yeah, just in the perspective of like a new way of planning and the urban designing and so on, and how those two things kind of come together. Yeah, so that's kind of what I wish. Great, thank you for sharing. That's kind of fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add a comment to that, it's definitely something we're still trying to figure out. So for instance, in this long-term plan review, where we're trying to do this thing on a signpost basis, right? Then there's been discussion that's still ongoing now about whether it is something that's threshold based in terms of the signpost. Like, do I
Yeah.
say that the population hits a certain percentage, then I trigger this option area to turn to housing? Or is
Yeah.
it something that's time-based that says, okay, I have reached year X, so now let me review the option? So the thing with threshold based is that, well, it's really based on the signal that's happening on ground. But what if the signal for population happens today, and then tomorrow the signal for industry happens, but I've already committed the option for residential today? Then I've just made like a very short-sighted decision, right? So it might be a combination of that. Like once a threshold hits, then I activate all of the options that are linked together. Then how do I create that system that tells me which options are linked together, the knock-on effects of this option that I'm triggering? Then the time-based thing also comes in that if a threshold is not triggered in time, I also need to take into account how long the infrastructure takes to build. So if say the train needs to come in 30 years before it's supposed to build, even though the threshold is not here, I still have to trigger and say, hey, you have to decide now, the train needs to be built or not. So it's probably a combination of all these things. So it's really pretty complex to work out.
Yeah. Last maybe a question is a little bit about, I mean, the thing you mentioned about, I mean, the separation, but still the separation between planning and transport in a way, which is like quite amazing, but it still exists and very strong everywhere. Recently we published a paper on the kind of distribution of residential and job in Hong Kong based on accessibility, on the three type of accessibility which are in Hong Kong, which is like MTR, road, which is a bus, which is 40% of, and then walking as well. And we get quite a good result in a way. So I was wondering if you have pursued, I think at one time, I think when we talk about public transport accessibility level kind of planning in a way. I know that it's something that I show to my students before or to them is like, say, look, I mean, London doesn't have a land use planning, they have a accessibility planning. And they look at me in disbelief because in China, they're all from mainland China. So there's no, I mean, everything is about land use in a way. And if you take away land use, they wouldn't know what to do. So I was wondering, I mean, if it's a conversation with, I know that, I mean, at one point, I mean, you explore the public transport accessibility level as a kind of like, yeah. And is that still kind of like ongoing, or is that kind of like,
yes.
Yeah.
So I would say that I think London, the TfL developed PTAL, and then they also developed the ATOS after that, right? I think there's accessibility to opportunities and services. I think that's quite a lot that Singapore is looking at as well on both fronts, on the PTAL and the ATOS. But nonetheless, I think as you described the difference between the UK and the Chinese context, I think we need to find that middle way, that 中庸middle way. Why? Because I think the way the Brits have gone is also because so much of development is left to the market. And as a result, the main levers they are left with are some of what they therefore have chosen in order to shape and negotiate with the developers. On the other hand, the way we do planning, which traditionally is a bit more top-down, we do need to bear in mind, as you have mentioned, how would the market respond to the different quality of the site? If a location is more accessible and accessible by a certain mode, it probably has a certain gravitas for certain type of activities. And therefore, I think what we have been looking at is how to find that combination, where on the one hand, allows us to be able to find the right site for the right kind of use, but in a way whereby while we guide, we also try not to do gravity defying tasks. And to not be gravity defying sometimes entails either unlocking the potential of really accessible sites, which is one of the focus that Singapore has put in especially the last few master plans. And the other is to improve the accessibility of certain sites so that it achieves that gravitas, the gravity drawing qualities.
Well, I don't know, because I mean, I think, I mean, the gravity world kind of modeling, I think what is intriguing as well with the PITAL, the public transport accessibility level map of London. I mean, you have in fact, you have a polycentric city, essentially, in a way, which is kind of like quite surprising, because usually transport model have a tendency to be kind of like really monocentric in a way, although, I mean, they have a tendency to reinforce, I would say, where there's most demand in a way, because that's always the model that has been set up. While the PITAL sound, I mean, seems to be producing a different of like map in a way. And that's, I mean, I like your suggestion to bring the two together and to take the best of both. I mean, yeah, that would be quite interesting. Maybe relaxing some of the kind of like land use definition, or broadening them in a way, and kind of, or make them kind of like how to say hybrid kind of type of like you have class of use which can be made equivalent to class of accessibility. I don't know, that's quite interesting. I mean, have you done some work already on that kind of things? I mean, on mixing those two approach? Yeah.
So I think when we look at I mean, even mentioned the Master Plan 19, I think it made a few key areas of higher focus. I think whether it's the Paya area or the Bishan area, I mean, these are areas that are at the intersection of several rail lines, and by themselves highly accessible. I think to be able to unlock more value of these locations, I think for Bishan we did a significant land rezoning from what was more residential in use to a more commercial use, to allow more jobs to be located in that location. So that's one example. But there are also other places that I think, for example, in the Punggol district, not digital district in the north, we recognized quite early that as an employment center, it does require better rail access. And as a result, through various planning levers, the rail line was extended to the area. So I think that principle then applies to how we look at some of the new growth areas as well, in trying to find that combination. Gravity defying is can be very tough.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. I think we should create a kind of conversation between members of the community like we had right now, because it's really interesting. So thanks a lot, Zhongwen and Yuan, for taking the time to share your experience, your insights, and it was really super inspiring. Thank everyone for attending this session, for asking questions. Thanks, Alan, for this very valuable exchange. So the recording of this session will be available very soon on our YouTube channel that is available on the chat. Our next Urban AI conversation will be next week, and we will talk about mobility as a service. So here again, if you want to register, the link is available on the chat. And yes, that's all for us. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.